Uh, so I'm going to talk today about the central part of the United States and where we are right now and what the outlook is for the next several months here. And on the front page, I have a photo of a cornfield underwater. And this is about a mile from my house. And so this was taken a couple of weeks ago back in really early July. Since then, that part of the field has pretty much died off, and so there's zero yield out of that part of the field. But if you go out a little farther into that field, there's actually some nice-looking corn, and I think that's going to be one of the stories that we're going to talk about today is how all this rainfall that we've had this summer and spring has affected the crops, and the fact that it's highly variable. One part of the field might be a disaster, another part might look great, and you might vary from field to field and state to state. So we'll talk a little bit about that as we move along here. So just some general information. As Doug said, we do these once a month, and the next one's going to be September 17th with Laura Edwards and Brad Rippey. We also record these, hopefully, and so they are available both from the Midwestern Regional Climate Center and the High Plains Regional Climate Center on their website. So there's the collection of links there, and I think we'll show those at the very end too. So, and here's some of our collaborators of climate services in the Central region. This is not an exhaustive list, but it kind of gives you an idea of the scope of who all is working on climate services. So, and as Doug says, there will be time for questions at the end. So the agenda today, we're going to talk a little bit about July 2015 and what the current conditions are like and the impacts we're seeing, as well as El Nino, and finally the outlooks from the National Weather Service. So I'll just kind of step through time here. These are a few maps that used to be the National Climatic Data Center. It's now the National Center for Environmental Information. And they do an excellent job of having monthly reviews of the climate around the United States and the globe. And so it's always great to look at the maps and text that they have available for to get an idea of how the month played out. It turns out July for us in the central part of the United States is actually fairly moderate. We were not as cold as last July, which was one of the coldest on records for many states, but this year it was definitely on the cool side, below average for many parts of the states in the central region. Those numbers there are the rankings. So for Iowa, number 29, it was the 29th coolest on record. So it's not really record-breaking by any means, but definitely on the mild side. And along with the milder temperatures, we also have seen a lack of heat. So we've seen very few days in the 95 to 105 degree range. So that's maybe good news for crops. But overall, a little on the cool side as we move across the central part of the United States. That is in contrast to the rest of the world, where it's been very warm, both on the continents and the oceans. And right before we got on the air, CNN just announced that from a NOAA press release that July was the hottest month on record for the globe, with those global records going back to 1880. So very impressive warm temperatures around the world. It just doesn't have to be in the United States, or at least in the central part of the United States. So that's the temperatures. This is the precipitation side. Overall, it's been fairly wet across the U.S. There's a few dry spots in the southeast there, but for the central region, most of the states were on the wet side during this time period. In fact, we had Kentucky was outstanding in having one of its wettest Julys on record. But we had several other states there, Illinois, Indiana, and Missouri, and Iowa also had very wet July records as well. So very impressive numbers for those particular states. But I'd say overall, just a very wet period for much of the central United States. And we'll look at that in more detail here in a minute. But it just kind of gives you a perspective of how wet it really was. So if we go in and zoom in on the central part of the United States, this is the 30-day precipitation. On the left-hand side is the actual numbers. On the right-hand side is percent of normal precipitation. So kind of the color scheme is if it's in the oranges and yellows, that means you're on the dry side. If it's in the blues, you're on the wet side, and green is somewhere in between there. So if you look at the left-hand panel, you can see a lot of rain that's fallen in parts of Iowa and northern Missouri. while the rest of the region has been relatively drier. It's been many areas have gotten 1 to 3 inches of rain outside of that area, and that's not necessarily a bad thing after the wetness early on. But we certainly have seen some rains in the central part of there. And if you look on the right-hand panel with percent of normal, yeah, kind of the eastern half looks a little on the dry side. But as I said, in a minute we'll show that that's not a big concern at this point. And then on the west side, we've seen a couple of dry spots. Right, North Dakota is one of the drier areas that we're sitting in right now for the last 30 days. But we also have places in Wyoming, Colorado, and Kansas that are dry as well. So if we look at the 30-day temperature, just look at the departures. So that's probably the most meaningful. If I look at the regional numbers, for the most part, we've been, if you kind of could break it up, it'd be the western half has been trending a little bit on the cool side, while the eastern half has been a little bit on the warm side, but nothing too spectacular. Most places are within a degree or two of their long-term average. So there's not any extensive long-term heat that we've had. I'd say probably most of us have experienced a couple of days of really hot weather, really uncomfortable weather, and then mixed in with that are days like today where it's much milder and lower humidity levels. So overall, for the last 30 days, not too bad, pretty close to the long-term average. This is the 90-day precipitation. And there you can see on the left-hand panel, we've got this large area of blues and purples in those areas. So in the last 90 days, we have many areas that are in those colors that are 18 to 26 or 30 inches of rain. So that's the new Lake Missouri there that we're constructing. And so there's a lot of rain in those areas, an incredible amount of rain, and that's on top of the rains that they may have gotten earlier in the spring as well. So those are some of our problem areas agriculturally, are that Missouri, Illinois, and on into Indiana and also Kentucky are probably the core areas where we're seeing the water problems. So the left-hand side is the actual precipitation. On the right-hand side is percent of normal precipitation. And you see that the areas that were purple on the left-hand side are definitely in the purple on the right-hand side. So that's, in many cases, we're seeing almost twice the average precipitation for that 90-day period. So pretty impressive rainfall amounts, especially in that Missouri, Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana region. But then you kind of move northward, and you're actually getting stuff that's a little closer to average in northern part of Iowa, and then up into Minnesota and the Dakotas, maybe a little bit drier up in there, and then Nebraska and Kansas and Colorado are also a little bit on the dry side too. So there's some wet spots and some dry spots, but overall there's a lot of green in there too, and green is good, so that's close to the long-term average. So we get, for the most part, we're in good shape in terms of the precipitation of the last 90 days, except for being too much of it. So there are some consequences of all that rain, especially the heavy rains back in June. Caused quite a bit of nutrients to get flushed into the rivers and streams, and then that eventually makes its way to the Gulf of Mexico, where it causes hypoxia problems. So that's just where you over-fertilize the local plant and material in the Gulf of Mexico, the algae and so forth, and then it uses up all the oxygen, and then it's bad news for any other thing like the fish. So the long-term average for that in the last 5 years is about 5,500 square miles. This year it was 6,500 square miles. So it's about 1,000 square miles above average. So it is one of the larger plumes that they've seen in quite some time. So that's kind of one of the consequences of all that heavy rain that we've seen across the Midwest. Now, what that also means is that a lot of the fertilizer that was put on crops early on was also flushed out there. So that means it wasn't available for the crops as well. So there's some issues with nitrogen management here at home as well as down in the Gulf of Mexico. There's a similar story for Lake Erie, another algae bloom there, and it's the same kind of mechanism. It's too much rainfall washing off into the Lake Erie in this case and over-fertilizing the algae there and causing it to bloom there. So that's just a satellite picture from a couple of days ago of the algae bloom. And it's a real mess. I've never seen it up close and personal, but it makes the beaches nasty, and of course it kills off the fish and so forth. So this is a real problem for those guys in the Great Lakes region. So getting back to agriculture, this is the number of days suitable for field work, and this is from the USDA numbers, and it's a summary of the last 20 weeks. And so you have a total of 140 days that you can work in the field. These are the guys, the 5 states that have had the most trouble with rain and during the same time period, Missouri, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa. And those have all running about 50% or so or less on the number of suitable days for field work. So that has impacts on some fields couldn't get planted, some fields were delayed and planted, and some of them were like the fields I showed in the picture that were planted. It came up, but then it got flooded, and then there's continuing problems as we move forward. So these are the areas that probably felt the effects the most from all that heavy rainfall in really since April, May, June, and July. So that's the 5 states that are probably the most problematic at this point. As a result, there's been some of these areas been declared agricultural disaster areas, mostly for the central region. It's Illinois and Indiana. I suspect there'll be more added on to this as well. It's kind of interesting in this map of disaster designations from USDA. Pretty much everything from the Rockies eastward is due to too much rain. All the disasters to the west of the Rockies is due to not enough rain. So we got drought on one side and too much rain on the other side as far as the situation on agriculture goes. So kind of interesting contrast there. And like I said, I suspect some of this will expand as we move forward here, but this is where we stand right now. And I know some of the other areas, I think Missouri just did a disaster declaration with FEMA, and I think that'll work its way into this as well. So that's the story on precipitation. One of the things that some people are starting to get nervous on is the fact that because we've had delayed planting in some places, that what the prospects are of frost. And this is a map of the median date, so it's kind of the middle of the distribution, the date of the first time we see 32 degrees in the fall. So the areas in blue there, especially the light blue, are late September. You get into the dark greens, that's early October. The light green is mid-October, and then the lightest green is late October. And you can see it for most of the central region, that pretty much spans the window for the median date. Now, the earliest dates can be, on average, they can be typically about 2 weeks earlier than that. So that's what we're looking at in terms of the statistics. And I would say at this point, our ability to forecast an early frost is pretty much zero after about day 2 or day 3. There's nothing like, if we have a cool July, we're higher risk of an early frost, or if there's an El Nino, we're at higher risk for frost. Those things just don't happen. There's just not that kind of connection there. So I suspect at some point we'll be addressing those rumors, but at this point, unless you're talking about short-term forecasting, it's really hard to see those things coming. So the agriculture issues, I kind of hit some of these already. The prevented planting, especially soybeans. That seems to be the bigger problem this year than corn. I think because early on, usually the sequence is you plant the corn first and then soybeans. We had some drier weather earlier on, so I think the corn did a little better job in that regard than the soybeans. But we have had several instances of delayed planting and slow development because if it's raining all the time, it's pretty hard for the crops to grow properly. And probably another concern right now is the poor root development, which at this point is limiting both water intake and nutrient uptake. So that's a concern in the low-lying areas. And as I mentioned earlier, we got the unevenness in the yield across the fields. And I think somebody mentioned that you could very well have a record yield on one end of the field and zero yield on the other end of the field. So I think that's going to be how strong the contrast is going to be. And there's also some concern of a wet fall in areas where the soils are already unusually wet. So we're going to be kind of sensitive to that. And then, like I said, the concern of an early frost, which I don't think is really there, but everybody always worries about it.
Hey, Jim, I just got a note from FEMA. Beth Freeman mentioned that just today, Missouri received an ag declaration for 105 counties. So
Okay. All right. See that? There you go.
Keep us all up to speed.
There you go. Yeah, I figured that was probably inevitable that they would be added to the list, given their rainfall history of this year.
Yeah.
So, despite all those the doom and gloom about yields, about 10% of the corn crop is rated as poor to very poor at this point. But the USDA forecast that came out earlier this month has the yields down a little bit from last year, but last year was the record year, so being down 2 bushels isn't that catastrophic. 11% of the soybean crop is rated as poor to very poor, and yet that yield is expected to be down just a little bit from 2014. Winter wheat yield is up a little bit from last year. So that, in terms of the big picture, the kind of things that were problems we're seeing don't seem to have that much of an impact at this point. But we'll see how things go as the combines start to roll. But at least right now, they're a little bit optimistic there, despite some of the ratings there. This is stream flow from the USGS. So green is good. Blue means they're actually above average. And then there's a few places with black dots, which is the records for this state for that particular stream. So looking at the central region, you can see that there's a lot of greens and a lot of blues. So at least in terms of stream flows, that part of the hydrologic cycle is in great shape for this time of year. So there's a few spots there in central Kansas, but that's about it. So again, it probably reflects all the rainfall we've had this summer, keeping those rivers and streams at or above average on the stream flow. Great Lake water levels, those are all up from the long-term average. All the lakes are above average. It was not that many years ago we were talking about how low the lakes were, and just in the last 2 years they've gone from being very low to very high. And again, it's all because of the wet spring and summer that we've had and all that runoff that's gone into the lakes. So they're actually well above average for this time of year. This is the U.S. Drought Monitor map that was just released this morning. And really, for the central region, there's not much to talk about. There's a little bit of dryness up in kind of that corner there of Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois, and that's that's not too severe at this point. It's all very short-term dryness, the last 30 to 60 days for the most part, and there's some dryness up along the Lake Superior as well, and a little bit farther east into Ohio. There's a little bit of dryness up there, but for the most part, the central part of the United States looks really great. And again, that's no surprise because of all the precipitation we've had. And of course, the California and those areas are still in pretty bad shape at this point. So now we'll talk a little bit about the climate outlooks. We'll talk about short term, and then we'll go into the monthly and seasonal forecast. So this is the precipitation amounts for the next 7 days. I got a giant donut hole over the eastern part of the Corn Belt there, but there's some rain expected up north in the Dakotas and Minnesota, and also rain to our south. But for the most part, the central U.S. is not expected to see too much precipitation in the next 7 days. If you look at the 6 to 10 day forecast, they've got left-hand panel is the temperature, right-hand panel is the precipitation. So the redness there is an indication of increased chances of above average temperatures, pretty much from the Rockies eastward on into almost Illinois there. So there's a large portion of the plain states and the western half of the Midwest is expected to have above average temperatures, and then cooler temperatures along the Ohio River Valley. And as far as precipitation goes, some precipitation over the northern tier states there, above average precipitation, but actually below average for the greater part of the Midwest and central region there. So big contrast there on the precipitation side. And like I said earlier, with the situation that we've had plenty of rain so far, soil moisture actually looks pretty good. So that's not too much of a concern at the moment. only if it continues would that be a problem. So here's the 8 to 14 day, pretty much the whole region with an increased chance of above average temperatures. This goes out to early September, and also below average precipitation from Missouri southward, and then continuation of the wetter conditions across the northern tier states. So that's the short term out to the 14-day mark. El Nino. So that's probably the story. It was certainly the story last week, and it'll probably be the story for the next several months. And we're referring, of course, to the warmer waters in the eastern Pacific Ocean along the equator there. And its life cycle is it typically starts up in the spring and summer months and gets fully developed in the fall and winter, and then starts to fade by the next summer and spring, or next spring and summer. So as you might expect, we probably see the strongest impacts from these events during the wintertime when it's fully developed and in place. And that's what we'll kind of see as we look at some of these forecasts here. So this is what the sea surface temperatures look like right now. One thing I want to mention on the side here is that on climate.gov, they've got what they call an ENSO blog, which is El Nino Southern Oscillation, and that's kind of the umbrella for all the El Nino-like events. I got a blog of experts there. It's a great resource for looking at these El Nino events in great detail. So it's a lot of interesting information there. So check that out. This is their temperature plot for the last 14 days there. Actually, about the last 20 days, average sea surface temperature. So the area in red there is 2 to 3 degrees Celsius. So you multiply that by 2 to get degrees Fahrenheit, and you can see how warm those waters are off the coast of South America there. So very warm water off the coast of South America. You also see another splotch of red off the coast of California and the Baja Peninsula there. So there's a lot of really warm water in the Pacific Ocean right now.
And Jim, that's just to be clear, that when we say anomalies, that means different than normal, above average temperatures.
That's right. That's above average temperatures there. So right now, the El Nino is ongoing. It's actually been going on for a couple of months now, but it's going through its development cycle right now. And right now, the forecast is a greater than 90% chance that it will continue through this winter, and an 85% chance of staying around next spring. So it's going to be there's very strong possibilities that this is going to stay around for a while. And just kind of give you a thumbnail sketch of warm episodes. This is what we mean when we say El Nino, the warm episodes. This is kind of the global picture of what happened. So it's really a global impact. So that's why we get excited about when this happens. And these are just kind of general impacts, kind of the tendency for these to happen. So it's really the biggest news is in Australia and Southeast Asia. They tend to be hot and dry in those areas, so lots of problems with drought. Probably has some of the bigger impacts, bigger negative impacts over there. For us, it tends to give us warmer winters and from Alaska on into the central U.S. and wet and cool conditions in the southern part of the United States along the Gulf Coast, and also impacts in South America there, some areas being wetter and some areas being drier. So that has impacts as far as corn and soybean production in South America. Those are the general impacts. As we zoom in on the United States, is kind of a schematic of, in general, how it plays out for us in wintertime. So the warm conditions throughout the central region, and then a dryness along the Ohio River Valley is kind of typical, and then wet along the southern states is that as the Pacific jet stream is pretty amplified and very active down there. And the polar jet stream, which gives us our really cold weather, stays pretty much to the north. So not only get milder conditions, but we typically get fewer cold air outbreaks in this setup. Now, having said that about all these general tendencies, no two El Ninos are alike, and even the strong events can be different. So we try to use language to kind of portray the fact that we're not talking about certainties, absolute certainties here. A lot of times they're what I call tendencies, or sometimes they say tilts the odds or increases the chances. Those kind of words to kind of soften the language a little bit on how these play out. And here's a classic example On the left-hand side is the winter temperature departures from average during the 1997-98 El Nino. That's the one where I got calls every day about how mild the winter was, and people were playing golf in Chicago in January. But then on the right-hand panel is a slightly less strong El Nino event in 2009-10, and we had a very cold winter, actually much colder than average. So that's kind of maybe an extreme example of how you can get different weather results out of something that's basically the same El Nino pattern. But it's just a word of caution that these things are a factor in our winter weather, but they're not the whole story there. So this is the INSO forecast showing that the red bar is the probability of it happening. So El Nino, the red bars here, is pretty strong, pretty much at the top of the chart, all the way through about the December, January, February, March time period. Then it starts to taper off a little bit. So this one, very strong odds all the way through the winter months, and then starting to taper off as we get into March, April, May time frame. But still pretty impressive odds even in March, April, May. They've got it at still at 70% chance of being an El Nino at that time. This is the forecast plume, or the spaghetti plot of all the models and what the sea surface temperatures will look like. And for this is.
Yeah, Jim, I just wanted to make sure that folks knew at the very bottom when you see those funny little letters down there, OND and NDJ and all that stuff, those are describing months. So if you take DJF, for example, that stands for December, January, and February. Nothing secret about that. Those are just designations for months.
Yeah, my favorite is sun there for September, October, November. So yeah, so these are 3-month forecasts, and they're moving along a 3-month window here. So they're stepping along a month at a time there, but it's looking at a 3-month forecast. Those sea surface temperatures, and so they've got a number of models they look at, and then if you kind of can summarize them, the dynamic models are that yellow line there. You see that pointed out with the red arrow there, and they've got it getting up to almost 2.5 degrees in the El Nino region there. And then here is the CPC consensus, and here is the statistical model. So it kind of gives you an idea that there, even though we talk about the forecast here, there is you get slightly different answers, and as you move forward, but you can see all of these. It kind of didn't. It's not by accident I placed these arrows where they are. That's about where they peak out as far as the forecasted temperatures in this region. So they're all around that November, December, January time frame that's expected to peak out and then start to taper off. So we'll see how that plays out. But right now we're just a little over 1.5 degrees Celsius, and then the anomalies will get a little stronger then as we move forward. So how does that play out in the forecast? Well, here's the September outlook. In the short term, it's probably not going to be as big a deal. It's going to be a bigger player as we move into the winter months. But here's the September outlook. On the left panel is the temperature, right panel is precipitation. So we've got in the central region, got this long band there of an increased chance of below average temperatures extending all the way from really the southwestern U.S. up into the central Midwest there. And then on the right-hand side, we've got increased chances of above average precipitation, basically from Missouri westward in the central region there. So that's kind of how things have been playing out. If you remember those earlier maps I showed of the last 30 and 90 days, we had a tendency for the western half of the region to have some pretty wet areas and also some cooler areas. So that's the September outlook. Here's the September, October, November outlook, and you still see that area in the southwest there of an increased chance of below average temperatures. But you do see some of the warmth on the east and west coast there. Those areas have an increased chance of above average temperatures. So some of that's starting to spill over into the central region at that point. But probably the bigger thing for us is this very large area of above average, increased chance of above average precipitation, pretty much from the southwestern U.S. all the way up into the Plain States and and parts of the Midwest and through the South there as well. So very wet conditions there. And they're starting to show some dryness and increased chance of below average precipitation and along the Great Lakes there and out to the East Coast. So that's September, October, November. They actually do forecast a 3-month forecast. They move forward once a month here. So there is a November, December, January forecast and so forth. But I'm going to just kind of skip through and do the non-overlapping ones. All of these are available on the Climate Prediction website, so you can pore over those in more detail. But this is probably, to me, the most interesting map of them all. This is December, January, February, so kind of our core winter months. And they've got this large area of an increased chance of above average temperatures from the west coast all the way through the central part of the United States and all the way out to Ohio there. So pretty much the central region is, almost all of it is, except for Colorado and Kansas, is in this area of increased chance of above average temperatures. And then you see on the Gulf Coast states that they've got an increased chance of below average temperatures. So I think that's kind of a classic winter El Nino temperature pattern. On the right-hand side, we got the precipitation, so wet across the southern part of the United States. And in the northern part, we got these two bullseyes, one in Montana and one over the Great Lakes. Those are areas with an increased chance of being drier than average. So they don't do a snowfall forecast, or at least officially they don't. Not that I've seen anyway. But, if you kind of read between the lines of if the parts of the central U.S. are below average on precipitation and tend to be above average on temperature, you would expect that could have some impacts on snowfall levels as well. We've done some historical studies that suggest that El Nino does tend to reduce the winter snowfall in some cases. So that might be another side effect of the El Nino this winter is the decreased snowfall, and at least in some areas, especially the Great Lakes there and the far west. So that's probably the months that we're going to expect to see the strongest impacts from El Nino. You get in the March, April, May time frame. By then, as you remember from the earlier stuff, that El Nino is the probability of occurring is starting to drop off, so it's more likely to be weakening at that point. And so its impact on us in the central U.S. is probably fairly minimal at that stage. So their March, April, May forecast, wet area down in the Texas region, cooler down there and also wetter than average. But really for us in the central region, probably the key things is just that slightly increased chance of being above average on temperatures across the northern tier states there, and a slightly increased chance of below average precipitation over the Great Lakes region. So not strong at that point. It's a pretty smaller area, and the probabilities are a little lower too. So it's not nearly as dramatic as it was during the wintertime months. Then we get into next June, July, and August, so next summer. And at this point, we're out beyond the dynamic models, and so really, for the most part, we're just kind of looking at trends for the last 10 to 15 years, I think, and not a whole lot to hang our hats on for next summer at this stage. So most of the central region is in what they call EC, which is equal chances of above, below, and near average temperature and precipitation. So there's really not too much to look forward to at this point in time for next summer. So those are the non-overlapping forecasts. Like I said, you can see all of the forecasts at the Climate Prediction Center website. This is their seasonal drought outlook. In the past, this would have been a big deal to look at these because we usually had some amount of drought in the central U.S., but we really don't this go around, so there's really not much to look at. They expect that those dry areas in the Iowa, Wisconsin area and up along, up there by Duluth, Minnesota, those dry areas are expected to recover in the next 3 months there. So really that's about the only problem areas we've got in the central United States at this point in time. So that's probably the big story is still the problems out on the West Coast. So kind of in summary, as far as current conditions, probably the big thing is this year has been the frequent heavy rains in both the spring and summer, and they've had a lot of impacts. And I've kind of hit the agricultural impacts pretty hard today, but it's also had other impacts in terms of flooding of people's houses and loss of life and from drownings and floodings and so forth. So there's been other negative impacts from it, not just agriculture. But also the increased runoff has produced water quality issues, probably not only on Lake Erie and Gulf of Mexico, but even the local rivers and streams that probably have increased loads of nutrients and fertilizer. El Niños, they're going to be the big story for the next several months. So fall, for the most part, an increased chance of being cooler and wetter than average in that southwest portion of the central U.S. I don't know how you call it that, but it's really the kind of that extension of the southwest U.S. extending on up into Kansas and Colorado and on into Missouri. So that area is going to expect to be cooler and wetter. The rest of us going to be equal chances. So that's how fall is going to play out. And then winter is an increased chance of being warmer than average, pretty much across the central region, and then potential dry areas, like I said, those two bullseyes over Montana and the Great Lakes. So here is more information on our partners. So we've got the links there to all the places I mentioned today, the National Climatic Data Center, which has changed their name, Climate Prediction Center, and Climate Portal, and Drought Portal, and then Drought Mitigation Center, and all that good stuff. So that'll be on the Regional Climate Center websites as well. So with that, I will stop, and we will try to field any questions you might have.
Hey, before we go to questions, just for fun, can we go back to the December, January, February maps, just to bring that up and show people the most exciting map from a climatological point of view. By the way, I'm Doug Cluck. If I didn't introduce myself earlier, I work for NOAA here in the Central Region. And we climatologists sort of get excited about El Nino sometimes, and this is one of the, what you may hear, this is a relatively strong one. We don't have a lot of confidence, however, when it comes to, strong or super strong or anything like that. So anybody who sort of makes, we don't put a lot of credence in, the difference between a one that measures 2 degrees warmer than normal and let's say 2.5 degrees. We simply just don't know what the difference in impacts. We're not sure anybody knows. There's a lot of variability to these things, as Jim was pointing out. But this is the reason. One reason we sort of get excited is one of our better indicators for outlooks this far out into the future. So you can tell somewhat by the temperature percentages there. It gets up to over 60% of likelihood of warmer than normal in those areas. For example, for temperature, that's a confidence level, and you're seeing some confidence from the Climate Prediction Center there. So I just wanted to make that point, and now we can open up for questions. If you have any questions, I think push #6, and we'll see if we can hear you. If that doesn't work, we'll find out pretty quick. Any questions from anybody? Open floor.
Yes, good afternoon. This is Bryce Anderson from DTN. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, Bryce. Thank you. Go ahead.
Yes, Jim, thank you for your presentation. And do you have any comments on how this fall might play out for impact on harvest with the pattern as you presented it?
Yeah, so I've scrolled back on the screen to that September through November forecast, and you can see that it's for the eastern part of the Corn Belt. There really isn't much to talk about in terms of precipitation. They got their EC there with equal chances, but if you look towards the west there, they are showing that area of increased chance of above average precipitation. So if we just take this at face value, it would suggest that you might have some harvesting issues in parts of Missouri and Iowa and places like that, and probably just as much of a pain is going to be that area of increased chance of below average temperatures during that time frame too. Because we got some, I talked to the Missouri state climatologist Pat Gannan yesterday, and he was commenting that the soybeans in Illinois and Missouri, especially, have been way behind, both in terms of being planted and also their development. So running on the cool side for a while is not going to be good news for them. And if it remains wet in those areas that have already had a lot of rain, that could be problematic for fall harvest. So I think it's probably going to be more of a concern to the west there in some of those areas. But right now, Missouri, Illinois, and Indiana have had so much rain that it's not going to take too much to make those fields pretty muddy.
Very good. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, this is Nancy Garter at the World Herald.
We hear you, Nancy.
Hi. Hey, so when you look at, and you touched on this, the fact that we were cooler than average across the central part of the U.S. in contrast to the global average, and it looks like we have a potential for a coolish, wettish fall, even as we're expected to globally go into our warmest year on record. What can you elaborate on that a little bit in terms of what I should tell my readers about that? What does that matter? What's the significance of that? And then the last question I had, and you touched on this also, but to draw the point a little finer, we haven't had any 100-degree days in Omaha this year, and I know we've had some in outstate Nebraska, but what can we make of a lack of 100-degree days? So thank you very much. Good call.
Thank you. So I guess to answer the second question first, as far as the really hot weather goes, for most of the central region, being on the wet side so much this summer and in the spring as well, and just the overall general weather pattern is such that it really has been very conducive to really high temperatures. So, I mean, really for us, we have to be pretty much in drought before we see a lot of this scorching hot weather, 100-degree range for most of the states. And I mean, that's maybe getting into southern Kansas is a little more common, but for most of that, it takes some really hot, it really takes drought conditions to get those really high temperatures. So the fact that, it's been raining a lot, it's been cloudy a lot, lots of wet ground, all that's conspired to hold down those temperatures. So that's maybe one of the upsides to, and maybe that's why USDA is a little more optimistic about yields, is the fact that, well, we've had water stress, we have not had the temperature stress that we've seen in other years. Now, as far as the first question goes, go ahead.
Jim, I was just going to simply add that we have seen some unprecedented heat indices, which combines actually the amount of moisture in the air and the temperature. So even at temperatures of 90 to 95, but dew points near 75 to 80 is pretty unhealthy. And if it lasts for a period of time, luckily it didn't last that many days in a row for the most part. But it's a different measure, and that would be something else we could probably track at some point that we don't, or if we do, we haven't put it on these presentations very well. So there have been days of unsufferable humidity. How about that?
Hey, there you go. Yeah, there was a period in late July there that had about 2 or 3 days that were really pretty intense, and I was in St. Louis one of those days, so it was pretty hot and humid. So it's a stress on humans and livestock during those situations. And let's see, getting back to the earlier question about global temperatures, and Doug and I were kind of talking a little bit about this before the call there, that he kind of saw that in that one slide of the ocean temperatures in the Pacific they're warm all for large areas of the ocean. We've got warm conditions not only along the equator, which is where we measure El Nino, but also off the coast of California, and those have been warm for quite a while. So that in itself will push up the global temperatures quite a bit. And then we've got some. If you look at the global temperatures, I don't have it. I didn't put it on the slides here, but for the most part, every place but the central U.S. has been warm over the land as well. So it's not just the oceans, but over the land surface, everybody's been warmer. It's just kind of the way the weather patterns worked out that we've been one of the cooler spots in U.S. Or in the global scheme of things.
And Jim, can you go back to the picture of the North America in terms of the impacts of ENSO on it? It's back there a ways.
Yeah.
Because there's sort of, that one. One thing I want to make really clear here, I think we both want to make clear here, is when that shows warm across, I think that's northern Wyoming, southern Montana, that word there, and that whole area there. Warm does not mean necessarily 75, 80 degrees through that time period. What it means really, and this is maybe not the best map or not labeled the best, it means warmer than normal. So even in North Dakota, instead of let's say, minus 20, it's only going to be minus 10, okay? But in terms of average, we're warmer than normal, okay? So take that all into account. Also, that area in the southern part of the U.S. that the forecast is for cooler than normal, or better chances of cooler than normal and wetter than normal conditions. We're not necessarily saying that it's going to be cooler down there. It could be, but not necessarily cooler than it is in Alaska or northern Canada. But what we're saying is it's going to be cooler than it normally is. So if it's normally 55, 60 degrees in Houston, we're saying, well, okay, this pattern is saying it's going to be more like 50 degrees. So it's all very relative, all right? I'm not making predictions that way. I'm just trying to give you an example of how you should translate this, as opposed to saying, oh, it's going to be just cold in the south and warm in the north, which makes no sense whatsoever in the wintertime.
That's right. So, yeah, that's the.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to second that point there about those being relative to each other, and yeah, it's just a translation, a matter of a few degrees, and not and not always that spectacular. But that is the pattern, yeah.
So when we tell our readers, as you've noticed, it hasn't been a scorcher of a summer. We've had wetter than average, cooler than average, lower than average temperatures. But then going back to the heat indexes that you mentioned, Doug, what else can you say about that in terms of why I think I understand this, but can you elaborate on why we've had such crummy heat indexes? And were you talking about that late July period? Is that what you're talking about?
I'm trying to remember exactly when that was in July, and even in June we had some warm periods, but it's mainly because there is so much moisture for the atmosphere to work with, or for the sun, if you will, to evaporate and put into the air. Okay, that's why. In a dry year, Jim was mentioning, in drought years, basically we talk about dew points all the time. If the dew point temperature is low, it's very easy to warm up that air faster. And the opposite is when it's very moist. It takes a lot more energy to warm the same air up.
And so, in a global warming world, can we draw the connection and say, even in summers when we're not going to be in drought and hot, we might be more miserable? This might be an indication of how we're going to be more miserable going forward because it's going to be cooler and still very humid. Can you make any?
I wouldn't go that far necessarily. I would say that there are, with the changes in climate, there is a propensity to have more moisture in the air, no doubt. And in some places there is that will make it more humid in places, but not everywhere. So I wouldn't make any blanket statements like that.
Hey, Doug, this is Jeff.
Yeah, hi, Jeff.
Hi. And I'm with the North Central Climate Science Center, where I'm ecological responses to all this stuff, so not a climatologist. But I think I didn't catch the name, sorry, but the reporter's got kind of an astute observation that maybe there's an opportunity to express to the readers the way global impacts play out differently in regions, and so it is the hottest year on record, but it's the coldest, or it's a very kind of anomalously wet and cooler year for us. So I don't know, maybe this is an opportunity to talk to educate people on kind of the difference between global temperatures and regional activities. And then I don't know where you'd take it from there, but I think it sounds like something I've heard from people too. Like, oh, wait a minute, this is the hottest year on record, and it's been a beautiful summer in Fort Collins. Right. So, I don't know, maybe the climatologist on the line could sort of say what is the sort of learning opportunity or the extra piece of information that kind of could be gleaned from that question.
I totally agree with you. That sounds like that would be another good reason to have a webinar just based on what that is and what that tells you. I think what we're trying to get at is that if it's a local effect or even a regional effect, it may have nothing to do with a global temperature. We've seen that over the last, I don't know how many months, certainly the last 2 winters when we've been pretty chilly in the Midwest part of the country. And we've seen lots of record temperatures for the globe, okay, or at least above normal temperatures. Sometimes that it's hard for people to think about something other than their backyard or state. So Nancy, I understand your duress in trying to explain this. But climate change is global, but different regions will continue to react differently. And the fact that we're having an El Nino, for example, this year, is going to cause North America to do the same thing. We're going to have what we call a subtropical jet it's more likely to be active and thus wet across the south. In the north, the Arctic or polar jet is going to be pushed further north, thus less of an influence, theoretically. So in between, then we have this sort of area of relatively warm and some places dry and some places wet as you get down to the subtropical jet. But those things have been happening for eternity, that pattern. So it's interesting to talk about sort of global change also with certain patterns that we know that have existed for a very long time. They're going to continue to exist over a long period of time for the same amount of time, and so they're going to continue. El Nino is going to still have the same impacts as La Niñas. The Arctic oscillations are still going to pour down cold air sometimes or make it easier for cold air to reach further south in parts of North America. We have to think more on sort of a long scale and incremental change and tipping odds one way or the other. If that helps at all, I don't know. But yeah, we could have a long conversation about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions today? Don't be afraid to ask.
Greg Schuler, Dynamic Spectacles.
Hey, Greg. How are you?
All right. Just a quick comment. One of the intended to get this on last month, but didn't. We expected a more intense dryness for here in August, then moderating temperatures up, a cool and wet December or November again, but then warm and dry, even more so than what the CPC has been forecasting for winter and spring. So anyway, just a different take.
Yep.
Variations upon with considerable similarities to what CPC is showing.
A couple graphics that we didn't show, Greg, and by the way, Greg works for a private climate and weather service in Missouri, but a couple graphics that we didn't show that come out of research show that the chance for extreme, let's say, and I won't get into a lot of detail on this, but the chance for more extreme wet conditions go up in the fall, as well as relatively cool temperature extremes in the fall for the central part of the country. So basically from Texas to North Dakota and some kind of gray zone around that, there are better chances for extreme sort of cool and wet conditions. And really, when I say extreme, if anybody really cares, it's like the top 20% or bottom 20% of events. So I think Greg's forecasts, I think, are leaning more that way. We don't. We have to stick with the Climate Prediction Center's forecasts, of course.
Right. And our comment was to illustrate, I think we're seeing enough additional area on both the warm and dry side where that'll be
right.
Seen as defining prediction for most everything east of the Rockies, actually.
Yep.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. A lot of possibilities out there for impacts. Anybody else? All right. Well, I do want to thank you all. It's been thank you, Jim, for giving a great presentation, and thank you all for coming. If you do have any questions or comments, feel free to write to Jim or I, and or me, I guess it is, and let us know. Or if you have any suggestions on ideas you'd like to see more of in these talks, let us know, and we'll try to implement them. Next call is September 17th, was it? Anyway, it's the third Thursday of September.
That's right.
Yeah, third Thursday of September. Laura Edwards and Brad Rippey from the USDA. Thanks all, and talk to you next month.